Hello, and welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Bright Line Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Dark Lightning 1536, and Master of None. You are the reason why this content remains with full cellular connection, and today we are going to discuss Amtrak, which is the nationalized version of America's passenger rail network. I have generally positive things to say about Amtrak over the years. They've had several missteps, of course, but for the most part, they have done their job in keeping America's passenger lines running. The only complaint I've ever had with them is getting connections to certain regions is very difficult, but that's not really Amtrak's fault, as there just aren't that many lines anymore. And in fact, a lot of Amtrak's lines aren't even owned by them, and they have to share lines with other companies. So it's a logistical nightmare, and they do a decent job all things considered, but in light of the success of talking about British Rail's UFO, I was trying to find something weird about Amtrak, and no, there's nothing like a UFO when it comes to Amtrak. I'm sorry. There's no Amtrak UFO. I was disappointed too, but there is an interesting topic that I thought we'd talk about. The Amtrak cell phone? Why would there be Huh? Let's go back a ways to the year of 1986. Amtrak had grown pretty strong over the course of that time. After a pretty rough start, they'd pretty much solidified their network, standardizing everything when it came to their coaches and their new locomotives. Things were going alright for them, and they were thinking about ways to improve the quality of the passenger service that they were to provide. After all, they were still competing with just individually owned cars and the airlines. They had to keep going toe-to-toe with them. And what better way than offering a new service with what was at the time considered brand new technology? Oh yes, that's right, cell phones. It was 1986. Who the heck owned a cell phone in 1986? Not many people. The first commercially available cellular phone was only released in 1983, and it was the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, which is an awesome name, but look at this thing. Look at that. That's insane. It's literally a brick. But it was impressive for its time, and did make calls. Of course, it was also violently expensive. It retailed for nearly $4,000 in 1984, which is just over 10 grand in today's money, for a cell phone. Which at the time, it was the only one. And it was exciting technology, but the point is, not many people could afford to own their own cell phone. And even if they could, would they really carry this thing around? Not really. Amtrak wanted a way for people to make phone calls from their train. And technically they already did have a way. There was a telephone service offered on their Metroliner cars between 1968 and 1979, but that wasn't a cell phone service. It used microwave frequencies that were allotted to them by the Federal Communications Commission. Those calls cost about $3 for the first 3 minutes and were billed to the user's home telephone number. The service was phased out by Amtrak because there weren't that many microwave frequencies that could be allotted to them, but there was a high enough amount of clientele that they thought could utilize a phone service available on their trains, and the market for this seemed to be more upscale. They were already quite aware of the Airfone service, which is a cell phone service that was operated on many airlines, so people could make calls from their planes. They reached out to the same company that did the Airfone and asked if they would be interested in doing a joint venture to create what would be called the Railfone. The Railfone doesn't look like a cell phone, it looks like a payphone. Which it is, but it's also a cell phone. It worked like a cell phone, except it was attached to their train cars. The phones were initially installed in 1986 in 46 cars, consisting of dining, club, and coach cars, and were at first only available on one of the Northeast Corridor runs between New York and Washington, which to be fair was one of the busiest runs in Amtrak's network. The calls, like cell phones, would be transmitted by low-frequency radio to ground stations, and then they would be switched to local phone systems, depending on where the call was going. And it was quite impressive technology for that era, and initially they offered service for the entire United States, including Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. Over time, the service was extended, more routes offered it, and international service was also allowed, but the cost of the service was, well, by today's standards, absolutely outrageous. Unlike the initial microwave system that was $3 for the first 3 minutes, the new rail phones would cost $5 for the first 3 minutes, and then $1 a minute thereafter. Now, it wouldn't matter whether the call was local or long distance, it would always be that rate, but man, you better really want to phone somebody if you're paying that much. But the clientele was supposed to be rich businessmen, who may have needed to utilize the phones for meetings or business calls, or even in the case of an emergency. The phones were there, was the point. And they were actually fairly successful. People did use them. As expensive as they were, they took major credit cards at the time, and wound up being a pretty profitable venture for everybody involved, at least at first. The Railphone's rates would be modified over the years, and at some point they would actually offer a monthly subscription service for people who did regular runs on the rail lines. You wanted to use the phone a lot, but didn't want to pay for it every single time? Just pay a flat rate per month, like a typical cell phone subscription plan. Sounds weird, but if you were on the train that often, it kinda makes sense. But by the early 2000s, things were taking a turn for the worse. Nobody was using it because by that point cell phones had really taken off. The great mobile boom had hit, and suddenly everyone and their mother had some kind of cellular device, whether it be a flip phone, and by the late 2000s, the smartphones came into being. Something like the Railfone, or even the Airphone, just couldn't compete with having the individual option, with everyone having their own individual plans, with their own individual phones. It's the same reason why no one uses payphones anymore. Because whether it was a cell phone or not, it was still effectively just a payphone. It stayed attached to the train, and you had to pay for it every time you used it, just like a payphone. Amtrak started offering the service less and less, and it was only available on very short lines, and mostly in older cars, and the service was defunct by the mid-2000s. It stands as a relic of the past, something that people just don't need anymore. After all, some of you may even be watching this on a cell phone right now. It just isn't something that could ever compete with the modern age. But for its time, it was an ambitious and actually quite genuinely good idea that served both commuters and Amtrak quite well. I did some digging trying to find people posting on old message boards who had actually used the Railfone while it was still operable, and those that say they have actually have pretty good things to say about the service. It was reliable, it genuinely worked. The only thing anyone ever complained about was that the background noise from the train could make talking on the phone quite difficult, but, I mean, it's a train. There's only so much they can do about that, so I kind of understand that issue. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.